How many times have you received that palm on Palm Sunday, carried it home with a full heart, and set it down somewhere without ever stopping to ask whether that was the right place? Most people do exactly that, with faith, with the best of intentions. But Saint Teresa of Avila, a woman who spent decades studying the spiritual behavior of sacramentals in homes and in her own convents, left behind a warning that very few people have ever heard. It is not enough simply to have the blessed palm. Where you place it determines whether that grace flows freely or comes to a standstill. And there is one particular spot and one specific place that Teresa warned should never be used. A place that many of us choose without a second thought. A place that seems perfectly logical, even devout, but which Teresa's mystical and spiritual experience tells us will quietly extinguish the very protection that palm was consecrated to provide. And if you're already casting your mind back, trying to remember which corner of your home you tucked last year's palm into, or the one from the year before that, I want you to know you are not alone in asking this question. Millions of Catholic homes keep blessed palms without ever realizing that placement matters just as much as the blessing itself. Teresa understood this because she didn't only pray, she observed. She watched the effect of sacramentals on souls, on spaces, on families. And what she observed led her to establish precise guidelines in her convents about where each sacred object should be kept. Her nuns followed those guidelines faithfully because they understood that behind every instruction lay a deep spiritual reason. What you are about to hear will not be found in any ordinary catechism, but it is woven into the living experience of a woman who knew the mysteries of God from the inside, and who wanted us to know them too. To understand why placement matters, you first need to know what that palm in your home actually is, not what it looks like, what it truly is. Palm Sunday is not simply the start of Holy Week, it is the day the Church does something extraordinary. It takes an object from the natural world, a branch of palm or olive, and draws it into the order of grace. The priest blesses it with ancient prayers the Church has safeguarded for centuries, prayers that call down upon that branch God's protective presence, the intercession of the angels, and the victory of Christ over death. In that moment, the palm is no longer just vegetation, it becomes a sacramental. And a sacramental, as Saint Teresa knew better than almost anyone, is not a decoration. It is not a pleasant memento from a spring mass. It is an instrument of grace that the Church places in the hands of the faithful to be used, to be activated by faith, to be woven into spiritual life in a conscious and ordered way. Saint Teresa grew up in a deeply Catholic family in Avila. From her earliest years, she watched her mother care for sacred objects with a reverence that was not superstition, but conviction. She saw that the family home had a spiritual order, that each blessed object occupied a place that was not random but intentional. When Teresa entered the Carmelite convent and began her life of deep prayer, that childhood intuition was transformed into mystical understanding. She began to see, with a clarity she herself described as a gift received rather than earned, that physical space is not neutral, that a room, a house, a corner carries a spiritual atmosphere that is built up or broken down by what inhabits it, by what happens there, by the objects that occupy it and the intention with which they were placed. In the Way of Perfection, Teresa does not speak directly about the physical arrangement of household objects because that book was written for her nuns and the convent already had its own rules of order. But in the book of her Foundations, that detailed account of how she established each new Carmelite house, something revealing appears. Teresa describes the great care taken in choosing the placement of every image, every blessed object, every sacred symbol. These were not decorating decisions, they were spiritual decisions. And the reasons she gives, though written for the convent, reveal a principle that applies equally to the Christian home. The principle is this: The grace of a sacramental does not operate in a vacuum. It operates in relationship with the environment where that sacramental is placed. A blessed object set in an orderly, peaceful space, one meant for prayer or quiet, radiates its grace outward into the surrounding area. But that same object placed in a disordered space, one marked by habitual conflict or indiscriminate mixing of the sacred with things that have nothing to do with God, does not lose its blessing entirely. God's grace is always greater than our mistakes, but its effectiveness as a shield, as a protective presence, as an active sign of Christ's victory in that home, is significantly diminished. And this is precisely what makes the blessed palm such a delicate case. Because the palm, unlike a medal or a scapular, is the kind of object that tends to be placed somewhere in the home and simply left there for months, sometimes years. It becomes part of the household scenery. It gets forgotten. And in that forgetting, a quiet process begins that Teresa would have recognized immediately. The sacred object remains physically present, but the soul's living relationship with that sacramental has gone dark. And when that relationship fades, when the palm stops being a living sign and becomes just another object among the objects of the house, its capacity to serve as a gateway of grace is meaningfully reduced. Think about this for a moment. There are families who have been placing the palm in the same spot year after year, decade after decade, without ever once asking whether that spot is appropriate. The palm arrives on Palm Sunday, it's brought home, it goes where it always goes, and it stays there until it crumbles apart, or until next year's palm takes its place. It's a habit, and habits, when they are no longer fed by awareness, hollow out. Teresa knew this danger better than anyone because she lived it in her own convents. She saw how even the most devoted nuns could relate to sacred objects in a purely mechanical way, going through the motions without truly receiving the grace those objects were meant to transmit. That is why she established guidelines. That is why she insisted that the outward order of the convent was a reflection of the inward order of the soul. Not as a cold rule, but as an invitation to keep alive the relationship between the person and the signs of God's presence in their space. The blessed palm is not a talisman that works simply by being present. It is a sign that speaks, that reminds, that protects, but only when the soul that received it continues to recognize it for what it is. There is something more serious than forgetting, however. Something Teresa warned about with a clarity that her biographers recorded carefully. There is a specific place where keeping the palm not only silences its grace, but actually introduces into the home a spiritual confusion that Teresa considered especially dangerous to a family's peace. Not because the enemy is more powerful than God, he never has been and never will be, but because that confusion disorients the soul. It robs it of the clarity it carried when it went to receive that blessing on Palm Sunday, and leaves it without the protection it sought when it brought the palm home with such faith. What place is that? The answer is closer to your daily life than you might expect, and when you hear it, something inside you is going to recognize it, because deep down, the soul that lives in grace already knows that not every place stands equal before God, the sacred grammar of the home. That is what Teresa might have called it, had she ever needed to give a name to the set of principles she applied so naturally in every convent she founded. It was not a theory. It was a living daily practice, born of years of observation and deep prayer. And that practice rested on a conviction Teresa expressed in different ways throughout all of her writings. The soul and the space it inhabits influence one another. What happens inside the soul eventually shows up in the order or disorder of the surrounding space, and in turn, the order or disorder of the space shapes the inner disposition of the soul. This is not vague mysticism. It is a truth the Church has recognized since its earliest centuries. Through the practice of blessing homes, of consecrating spaces, of establishing in every Christian household a corner dedicated to prayer, a place where sacred objects could speak without being drowned out by the noise of the world. The first Christians, who gathered in homes because they had no churches of their own, instinctively understood that the space where you pray is transformed by that prayer, that the repeated presence of prayer leaves a mark on the atmosphere, invisible but real, perceived by the soul every time it enters that place. Teresa inherited that intuition and deepened it. In The Way of Perfection, when she speaks of mental prayer and the conditions that favor it, she mentions almost in passing something that deserves far more attention than it usually receives. She says that a recollected soul finds God more readily in the places where it has prayed before, because those places hold something like a memory of the divine presence. God is not more in one place than another. Teresa is careful to clarify that is not her point. Rather, the soul accustomed to meeting him there arrives at that place already disposed, already oriented, already with the inner door slightly open. The space cooperates with the soul, or it can get in the way. And if a space built up by prayer can make it easier to encounter God, a space marked by accumulated disorder can make it harder. That is what Teresa observed. That is what led her to be so attentive to the arrangement of her convents, not out of exterior perfectionism, but because she knew that each object in its right place was a small act of faith made visible in physical space. An act that said, here, we acknowledge that God is real, that His grace is real, that these signs are not decoration, but presence. The blessed palm fits into this principle in a very particular way. When the faithful receive it on Palm Sunday and bring it home, they are performing a gesture with a clear intention, to bring into their home the memory of Christ's victory. The palm is the sign of that victory. It is the branch that the crowds waved when the king entered Jerusalem. It is the announcement that death would be conquered, and when that branch has been blessed by a priest, when the church has called down God's grace upon it, it becomes a silent sentinel of the home, a sentinel that reminds us each day, without words, that Christ has won, and that His victory extends to this house, this family, these lives. But a sentinel placed in the wrong location cannot carry out its mission. A soldier stationed where he does not belong cannot defend what needs defending. Teresa, who frequently used military imagery when writing about the spiritual life, would have recognized that analogy immediately. The palm placed without discernment, in a spot that contradicts its sacred nature, does not cease to be a sacramental, but its voice goes quiet. It no longer speaks. It no longer reminds. It no longer protects with the clarity it was given to protect. So which place contradicts its nature? Teresa identified it through a very concrete observation about the domestic life of her time. In 16th century homes, as in many homes today, there was a tendency to place religious objects in the most trafficked, most visible, most public spaces of the house, near the front door, on the main sideboard, close to the table where the family gathered. The intention was good, that everyone would see them, that everyone would be reminded, that faith would be present at the heart of family life. But Teresa noticed something troubling in that habit. When sacred objects are placed in the highest traffic areas, they are subjected to everything that happens in those areas. Arguments, tension, visitors with very different beliefs, conversations that do not build up the soul. The emotional upheaval of a family that lives and struggles and makes mistakes, as every family does. And the sacramentals, which were designed to be signs of peace and divine presence, end up as silent witnesses to everything that contradicts that peace. They don't lose their blessing, but their function as signs becomes clouded by the context they are immersed in. This led Teresa to establish in her convents a guideline her nuns understood as an act of love towards sacred objects. Each sacramental must be in a place that is coherent with its nature, a place where what happens around it does not contradict what that object proclaims, where the palm can go on being what it is, the silent announcement that Christ has won and that his victory protects this home. Is there a place like that in your home? A place where the palm you receive this Palm Sunday can do what it was consecrated to do? There is an answer to that question, and it begins with understanding what kind of place Teresa identified as the most dangerous for a sacramental of this kind. There is a scene that repeats itself in millions of Catholic homes every year, and very few people recognize it for what it truly is. Palm Sunday arrives. The family goes to Mass. They receive the palms. They bring them home with genuine devotion, and then comes the moment of placing them. Someone picks up the palm, looks around, and puts it where it seems natural. Behind the crucifix in the living room, over the frame of the front door, in the corner where the image of Our Lady stands, in the bathroom next to a holy card, because someone thought that room could use some protection too. In the kitchen, because the kitchen is the heart of the home. In the children's bedroom, because children need extra care. In the grandparents' room, because the grandparents are unwell and need comfort. Every single one of these intentions is good. Not one of them comes from carelessness. They come from love, from faith, from a genuine desire to fill every corner of the home with God's protecting presence. But Teresa would have looked at that scene with the eyes of someone who has learned that good intentions on their own are not enough. That faith without discernment can produce results quite different from what the soul hoped for. Not because God punishes ignorance, but because grace operates according to spiritual laws that the Church has always known and that the saints have discovered through patience and prayer across the centuries. The first kind of place Teresa would have pointed to as problematic is the one that mixes the sacred and the worldly with no real order or intention. We are not talking about sacred objects needing to be kept in a glass cabinet, untouchable and removed from real life. Teresa was far too human, far too practical for that kind of extreme. We are talking about something quite different, spaces where the sacred is reduced to a decorative element among objects that have no relationship whatsoever to faith. The shelf where the palm shares space with souvenirs from holidays abroad, with framed photos from purely social occasions, with objects that belong to an entirely different logic than the logic of grace. In that context, the palm goes silent. It is there physically, but spiritually it has nothing to say. The second problematic space is more delicate and more common than it might seem. It is the spot in the home where the family's most intense conflicts habitually take place. The sitting room where the most painful arguments happen, the hallway where people pass each other in loaded silence, the bedroom where the relationship between two people has fractured. Teresa did not say sacramentals could never be in such places. She said something more nuanced, that a sacramental placed in a space of habitual conflict, with no one consciously praying for that conflict, with no one activating the grace of that object with intention and faith, ends up being a presence that hurts, because it reminds us of what should be and stands in painful contrast to what is. And that contrast, rather than healing, can deepen the wound. But the third place, the one Teresa identified most clearly and returned to most insistently, is the one that surprises people most when they first hear it. And it is the place that most people choose without thinking twice. It is the home's entrance space, specifically the threshold or front door, when that threshold is also the passage through which everything enters the house indiscriminately. Everything that arrives without being considered, everything that crosses that boundary without anyone asking what it carries with it. The front door of a home is, in the spiritual tradition Teresa knew so deeply, a place of the highest symbolic and spiritual importance. It is the boundary between the outside world and the sacred space of the home. And for precisely that reason, placing the palm above the front door seems logical, seems in fact like the most obvious spot for a sign of protection. If the palm protects, shouldn't it stand where threats try to enter? Teresa would say no, or at least not always, and not in just any way. Because the front door of many homes is not only the entrance for people, it is the entrance for conversations that wear the soul down, for moods brought in from outside, for accumulated weariness, for the tensions of the world. And when the palm is placed there, with no ritual of activation, no prayer to awaken it, no conscious awareness among the family of what that sacramental is called to do, it is left exposed to all of that flow with no support of its own. It cannot protect because it itself needs to be sustained by the prayer of the household. And there is something more that Teresa would have added with that characteristic directness of hers. There are homes where, right alongside the blessed palm at that entrance, there are objects belonging to other spiritual traditions, figures that are not Catholic images, symbols whose origin is not Christian faith, objects brought back from travels or given as gifts by well-meaning people who do not share the same faith. Teresa knew that phenomenon in her own time and named it plainly: a mixing that confuses the soul and extinguishes the spiritual clarity of the home. Not because those objects carry some automatic malevolent power. Teresa was far too grounded to fall into spiritual panic, but because the unexamined coexistence of the sacred alongside what belongs to a different spiritual framework produces in the souls of those who live there a quiet confusion, an inability to clearly perceive God's protection, a vague feeling that something never quite settles, that the peace being sought never fully arrives, that prayers rise but seem to find no clear path. And that confusion, Teresa knew, is one of the most subtle and most effective ways the soul loses its spiritual bearings, not through dramatic blows, through gradual dimming, through the slow fading of a light that no one deliberately extinguished, but that was left without the oil it needed to keep burning. Teresa did not arrive at these conclusions through intuition alone. She arrived at them by the only road she ever trusted, the one she described in her own writings: prolonged prayer, lived experience, and the constant testing of what the soul perceives against what the Church teaches. She was a woman who distrusted her own mystical experiences until she had verified them with her confessor and the tradition of the Church. That same demand for rigor she applied to everything she observed in the spiritual lives of those around her. And what she observed in relation to sacramentals and the spaces of the home led her to articulate something that her biographers recorded as one of her most practical and least known teachings. She never wrote it out in a systematic treatise. Teresa never wrote systematic treatises. She left it scattered through her letters, her conversations, the instructions she gave to the prioresses of her convents, in those small marginal comments alongside her great works that sometimes contain more wisdom than the main chapters. In The Way of Perfection, in the chapter where she speaks of the love the sisters should have for one another and of the order that should reign in the convent, Teresa writes something that for centuries was read only as advice for the communal life of nuns, but which contains a spiritual principle of far broader reach. In her own words, Saint Teresa wrote, "It matters greatly to understand that not every place has the disposition to receive what God wishes to give, and that she, who does not seek to have this disposition, places the obstacle herself." Those words, written to describe the soul in prayer, apply with perfect coherence to the home space that receives the sacramental. Not every place has the disposition to receive what God wishes to give. That sentence is the key. The blessed palm is a vehicle of God's grace, a specific grace, the memory of Christ's victory, the protection that victory extends over the home, the peace that flows when a consecrated object fulfills its function in a space that is prepared to receive it. But if the place where the palm is set down does not have that disposition, if it is laden with the dynamics we have already described, then the grace God wishes to give through that sacramental meets an obstacle. Not because God gives up easily, but because He respects the freedom of the soul and the order that soul has established in its own space. This is the heart of Teresa's warning. It is not a warning born of fear. It is not the threat of punishment for having placed the palm in the wrong spot. It is something far more tender and far more loving than that. It is the warning of a spiritual mother who watches her children missing out on a grace that was available to them, simply because no one ever told them that placement matters, that the disposition of the space matters, that sacramentals are not automatic. They require our conscious cooperation in order to deploy the full force the Church has entrusted to them. Teresa knew the weight of that missed grace because she had experienced the opposite, the joy of a well-ordered space where sacred objects could speak freely and God's grace could flow without obstacle. In every convent she founded, one of her very first concerns was precisely this. Before the nuns arrived, before communal life began, Teresa ensured the space was ready, not merely clean, but ordered spiritually, every image in its place, every sacramental in the space that belonged to it, every sacred object surrounded by a context that respected its nature and favored its mission. And when something was not right, when a sacred object had been placed somewhere Teresa considered unsuitable, she moved it, without drama, with the same naturalness with which you correct the course of a sail that has been rigged backwards, because the error was not moral, it was practical. It was the difference between a grace that flows and a grace that is waiting for room to flow. So what does the soul do upon discovering it has made that error? What does the person do who has been bringing the palm home for years and always placing it in the same spot, and who now understands that the spot was not right? Teresa would have answered that question with the same tenderness she showed her nuns when they made errors of spiritual discernment. There is nothing here to repair with anxiety. There is no irreversible harm. God's grace is larger than all of our mistakes put together, and the soul that becomes aware and makes a correction is doing exactly what God hopes, acting with humility, with trust, and with the serenity of someone who knows that God's love is not exhausted by our missteps. What does matter is not carrying on as before, once the light has been seen, that Teresa would say with firmness. Because to continue unchanged after understanding something is not ignorance, it is resistance. And resistance is the only obstacle God cannot overcome without our cooperation. Not because He lacks the power, but because He has made us free, and He honors that freedom to the very end. But what then is the right place? What is the space in the home where the palm can fulfill everything it was consecrated to fulfill? That answer hasn't come yet, and it won't come until you understand something more about what happens in homes where Teresa's warning was ignored for years. Because the effects are not always dramatic or visible. Sometimes they are silent, and silent effects are the hardest to recognize and the most urgent to address. There is a kind of domestic suffering that has no clear name. It is not a crisis. It is not a tragedy. It is not a sin that can be confessed and resolved in a single visit to the confessional. It is something more diffuse and more persistent. A feeling that many families know well, even if they struggle to put it into words. The sense that peace in the house never quite settles in for good. That prayers are said, but something never seems to sit right. That conflicts get resolved, but keep coming back. That there is an invisible weight the people in the home carry, without being able to trace its source. Teresa would have recognized that description immediately. Not because she had a supernatural explanation for every domestic difficulty, that was never her way, but because she had accompanied enough souls on their spiritual journey to know that this kind of diffuse unease often has a cause that is not psychological or relational, but spiritual. A cause connected to the order or disorder of the sacred life within the home. There is a woman in Guadalajara, Mexico, who prayed the rosary with her family every evening for years. They were a devout, practicing family, present at Sunday Mass without fail. And yet something in their home could not find peace. The arguments among the children repeated themselves with an intensity that bore no real proportion to the causes. Her husband was passing through a deep spiritual dryness that neither frequent communion nor regular confession seemed to ease. She herself felt as though her prayers rose to the ceiling and went no further, as though there were an invisible ceiling above the house, blocking grace from coming down freely. One day, during a talk at her parish about sacramentals, she heard someone speak about the importance of where sacred objects are placed in the home. On her way back, she looked at the corners of her house with new eyes, taking in all the places where she had distributed sacred objects over the years. And she found exactly what Teresa would have found. The Palm Sunday palm from 3 years earlier placed on the entry hall table, alongside a trinket brought back from a holiday in Cancun, a picture frame with family photos from social events, and a decorative figurine someone had given her, whose origins she had never quite looked into, but had never questioned either, because it was pretty and seemed harmless. None of it was malicious. None of it had been placed with bad intent. But the combination created precisely what Teresa would have called a space of spiritual confusion, a space where the sacred and the worldly lived side by side with no order and no intention, a space where the blessed palm had been reduced to one element in a decorative landscape with no spiritual coherence, where the grace of that sacramental was trapped in a context that simply would not let it speak. That woman changed everything, quietly, without fuss. She removed the palm from that spot. She took away the objects that had no connection to her faith. She cleared the space, and she placed the palm somewhere that was now prepared to receive it, next to the family crucifix, in a corner of the sitting room where the family gathered to pray. She did it with a small prayer, plain and simple in her own words, asking God for that palm to take up its mission again as a sign and as protection in her home. The change was neither immediate nor dramatic. Grace rarely announces itself with special effects. But in the weeks that followed, that family began to notice something they hadn't even realized they'd lost until they got it back. A lightness in the atmosphere, a greater ease in praying together, a reduction in the intensity of the conflicts that, without disappearing, began to resolve themselves with a speed and a peace that hadn't been there before. Her husband felt something again in communion after months of dryness. Her children started wanting to be at home with a spontaneity that surprised even them. Did moving the palm cause all of that? It would not be honest to say it quite that way. God's grace does not work like a mechanism whose lever is pulled by a physical gesture. But what is true is that this gesture was the beginning of a process of greater spiritual awareness in that home. A process in which that family began to ask themselves, perhaps for the first time, what each object in their house was saying about the faith they professed. And that question, asked with honesty and with love, opened doors that had been closed without anyone ever knowing they were closed. Teresa would have smiled at that story, not with condescension, with recognition, because it is exactly the kind of story she lived many times over, in her convents and in the lives of the people she accompanied spiritually. The story of a soul that had done nothing wrong, but who, by doing something better, discovered that God's grace had been waiting for that small movement in order to flow a little more freely. And this brings us to a question you may already be asking yourself. A question about your own home, about the sacred objects in it, about the places where you have kept them, and the years they have been sitting there without anyone ever going back to ask whether they are still in the right spot. Don't rush to answer it just yet, because the full answer requires understanding something more about what Teresa taught. Something about the Carmelite tradition of domestic order that completely changes the way you look at the space where you live and pray. When Teresa of Avila founded a new convent, the first thing she did was not arrange the nuns' schedule or distribute household responsibilities. The first thing she did was walk through the space. She moved through every room, every corridor, every corner with an attentiveness that her companions described as though she were reading something the rest of them could not see. And on that first walk through, Teresa made decisions that sometimes surprised those with her. Decisions that seemed precise and yet somehow intuitive. This image here, not there. This crucifix on this wall, not the one opposite. The blessed palm from the previous year in this spot, which would also receive the new Palm Sunday palm when it arrived. Her nuns learned not to question those initial decisions. Not because Teresa was authoritarian, though she could be when necessary, but because over time they understood that each decision rested on a reason that, once explained, made complete sense. Teresa never acted on whim or aesthetics. She acted on what she called in her writings the understanding of spiritual things, that faculty of the soul which, purified by prayer, begins to perceive the invisible relationships between objects, spaces, and the inner dispositions of the people who inhabit them. The Carmelite tradition of domestic order, if we can call it that, rests on three principles Teresa never formulated as a list, but which emerge clearly from the way she arranged sacred spaces. The first is the principle of coherence. Every sacred object must be surrounded by a context that is consistent with its nature and its mission. The second is the principle of active visibility. Sacramentals must be placed where they will be seen regularly, where the eyes of those living in the home will naturally fall on them during the day, not as decoration, but as a living reminder. And the third, the deepest and the most demanding, is the principle of renewed intention. It is not enough to place the object in the right spot once. The soul's relationship with that sacramental must be renewed periodically, through prayer, through awareness, through the explicit recognition of what that object means and what grace it is called to transmit. It is this third principle that most often gets forgotten, and it explains why many Catholic homes, which have all the right sacramentals in reasonably appropriate places, still fail to experience the fullness of protection and grace those objects are meant to provide. The palm is there, the crucifix is there, the image of Our Lady is there, but no one speaks to them. No one looks at them with real awareness. No one has renewed the covenant of faith with them since the day they were set down. Teresa, in the book of her life, describes with disarming humility how she herself took years to understand that prayer is not only an abstract exercise of the soul, but a concrete, lived relationship, one that is fed by signs and by tangible presences. She writes that for a long time she found it enormously difficult to gather herself in prayer because she did not know how to make her inner life a suitable space for encounter with God. And it was through the contemplation of sacred images and the presence of blessed objects in her cell that she gradually learned to create that inner space. The exterior objects helped her build the interior order, not as crutches, as silent teachers who reminded her each day that God was real, that His grace was real, and that the soul could and should prepare itself to receive it. This casts the question of the blessed palm in a completely new light. We are not simply talking about an object that needs to be in the right spot in order not to lose its effectiveness. We are talking about an object that must be part of a living relationship between the home and the grace of God. A relationship built through small daily acts of recognition, through the glance that pauses a moment before the palm and remembers that Christ has won, through the brief prayer that awakens it as a sign of that victory, through the deliberate choice that this corner of the home should be a space where God's grace is welcomed and where nothing contradicts that welcome. In Teresa's convents, the arrival of the Palm Sunday palms was a moment of great communal significance. The nuns did not simply receive them and put them somewhere. They received them within the liturgy, carried them into the convent with full awareness of what they were carrying, and placed them in spots that had already been prepared. spots that had been cleared of anything that might hinder the grace of the new sacramental, spots that were, in the deepest sense of the word, worthy of what they were about to receive. And Teresa insisted that the preparation of the place was just as important as the palm itself, because the palm carried the grace of the liturgical blessing, but the prepared place carried the grace of human disposition. And when those two graces met, when the Church's blessing came to rest on a space the soul had readied with love and intention, the result was something Teresa described with a word she used with great precision and very sparingly: consolation. Not a sentimental consolation, a profound one. The consolation of a soul who knows its home is protected, not by magic, but by living faith, by real grace, by the victory of Christ, still active and present in the space that was consecrated to Him with such simplicity and such sincerity. Does your home have that consolation? Or is there something that still hasn't quite settled? The answer is closer than you think. And it has everything to do with what Teresa discovered about the relationship between place, intention, and the prayer that activates the grace of a sacramental. There is a moment in the spiritual life that Teresa describes in the interior castle, with a precision that, when you first read it, produces something very close to recognition. Not the feeling of learning something new, the feeling of hearing someone name something you already knew but had no words for. Teresa speaks of the instant in which the soul stops acting out of habit and begins acting out of awareness. The instant when faith stops being a set of inherited practices and becomes a living personal relationship, sustained by the will and by love. That instant changes everything. It changes the way you pray, the way you go to confession, the way you receive communion. But it also changes something that Teresa would mention among her most everyday and most profound observations. It changes the way you relate to the sacred objects in your home. Because when the soul moves from faith by habit to faith by awareness, sacramentals stop being pious furnishings and become conversation partners. Living signs that the soul recognizes, looks at, tends to, because it knows that in them there is a presence that deserves to be honored. And in that shift, that movement from habit to awareness, lies the deepest answer to Teresa's warning about the blessed palm. Because the most dangerous place a palm can occupy is not simply a physical one. It is an interior place, the place of indifference, the place where the sacred object is present but not truly seen, where it has been blessed but is no longer recognized, where it was placed with good intentions 3 years ago and has not received a single conscious glance since. Teresa would put it this way, with that blend of tenderness and frankness that was so distinctly hers. Do not fear the wrong spot in your home as much as you fear the soul that has stopped seeing what it has. Because the soul that sees, that recognizes, that renews its relationship with the signs of grace, can correct any error of placement with a prayer and a simple gesture. But the soul that has stopped seeing cannot correct anything because it does not know what needs correcting. This interior dimension of Teresa's warning does not cancel the exterior one, the one we have been exploring, about the physically inadequate places. Both are real, both matter, but the interior dimension is more urgent because it is the root from which all the exterior errors grow. A soul living in spiritual awareness will rarely place the palm in an unsuitable spot. Its spiritual instinct will naturally guide it toward what is right. And if it makes a mistake, it will notice quickly and correct it without anyone needing to point it out. A soul living in habit, on the other hand, may have the palm in exactly the right place and still not receive the grace of that sacramental, because the relationship with the sacred object has been drained of intention. The palm is there, in the appropriate spot, but no one in the house actually sees it anymore. It has become part of the landscape, like the crucifix that has hung on the same wall for so long that eyes pass over it without stopping. Like the image of Our Lady that no one truly looks at anymore because it has become so familiar that it has lost its power to arrest. Teresa knew this was one of the subtlest dangers of the life of faith in the home. Not hostility towards the sacred, but numbness. Not the rejection of God, but His gradual forgetting. And Palm Sunday, with its freshly blessed palm, was for her an extraordinary annual opportunity to awaken that sleeping awareness. To bring into the home an object that was literally new, that had not had time to become invisible, that still carried the freshness of the liturgy on it, and to place it, with the soul's full intention, in the place it deserved. That is why Palm Sunday in Teresa's convents was far more than a liturgical rite. It was a renewal of the spiritual order of the communal home. The palms from the previous year, those that had served their time, were retired with reverence and burned in prayer, offering their final service as sacramentals in the form of intercession for the souls in purgatory. And the new palms arrived into spaces that had been prepared to receive them, places that had been cleared, cleaned, ordered with the explicit intention that the grace of this new Palm Sunday could settle in freely and remain active throughout the year ahead. That annual cycle of renewal was, in Teresa's mind, a perfect image of the spiritual cycle of the soul. Grace that grows dim, not because it loses its nature, but because the soul stops seeing it. Renewal that comes, not because the previous grace failed, but because the soul needs that gesture of beginning again in order to reawaken its awareness. The order of the convent as a mirror of the interior order, Teresa invited her nuns to cultivate without ceasing. And now, after everything you have heard, after traveling this road from the opening question to this point, there is still something that has not been said. Something Teresa saved for her most intimate teachings, for the conversations she had with her most spiritually advanced nuns. Something about the specific prayer with which she herself would seal the placement of a sacramental in a new space. Something that changes everything, not because it is an esoteric secret, but because it is so simple and so deep at the same time that when you hear it, you will understand why the palm you bring home this Palm Sunday can be different from everyone before it. The right place for the blessed palm does exist. And Teresa identified it with a clarity that left no room for ambiguity. It is not the only possible place. Homes are all different, and God's grace cannot be contained in a single formula. But there is a type of place that Teresa always pointed to as the most appropriate for a sacramental of this kind, and which she consistently used in her own convents without exception. It is where the family prays, or where they should be praying. Not the front hallway, not the kitchen, however much it may be the heart of the home, not a room that people simply pass through, not the space where the full tumble of domestic life plays out with all its mingled joy and conflict and noise and exhaustion, where the family prays, the corner of the home that has been set apart, even if only implicitly, as the space of encounter with God, the place where the main crucifix of the house stands, where the image of Our Lady keeps watch over nighttime prayers, where the rosary rests when it is not in someone's hands, where candles are lit in moments of petition and gratitude. That place has a different atmosphere from the rest of the house, not because it is necessarily tidier or more beautiful, but because it has been inhabited by prayer, because the souls of those who live there have deposited something in it over time, invisible but real, the substance of their relationship with God. The urgent petitions of difficult nights, the thanks given in moments of relief, the tears that had nowhere else to be wept but that corner with the crucifix, the rosary said when someone was ill, the prayer whispered in the small hours when fear wouldn't allow sleep. All of that accumulates, not in any superstitious way, not as though the walls held a magical memory, but in the deeply spiritual sense that Teresa articulated when she spoke of places where the soul has prayed before as places carrying a special openness to grace. The soul that returns to that place returns already oriented toward God. And the sacramental resting there rests in a context that is coherent with its nature and that supports its mission. The palm placed in that space is not only in the right place, it is in ongoing conversation with the other sacred signs that surround it, with the crucifix that proclaims the same victory the palm symbolizes, with the image of Mary who intercedes for the family from that corner, with the rosary that has moved through the mysteries of faith in the same hands now holding the freshly blessed palm. There is a spiritual coherence to that gathering that multiplies the effectiveness of each element, not arithmetically, but in the way grace operates when it finds a disposition that welcomes it with intention and with love. And Teresa added something more, something about the way of placing the palm in that spot, something her nuns learned to do with a simplicity that was at once deeply liturgical and deeply personal. The palm was not set down in silence, the way you might put a plant on a shelf. It was placed with a prayer, a short prayer their own, rising from the heart of the one who carried it, consciously activating the sacramental in this new space. A prayer that said, in whatever words each soul could find, something essentially simple. Lord, this palm that your church blessed in your name, I place in this spot, so that it may stand as a sign of your victory in my home, so that all who live here may be reminded that you have won and that your grace protects us. That prayer was not a magic formula. It was a conscious act of faith. The soul saying to God, I know what I hold in my hands, I know what I am doing, and I do it with the full intention that your grace should work through this sign and through this space. And Teresa, who had spent decades studying the relationship between the soul's intention and the effectiveness of grace, knew that small act of awareness made a real difference. Between a palm simply placed and a palm truly installed as a sentinel of the home, there's one final element that Teresa shared with her closest nuns, and it completes everything we have journeyed through together. The palms from the previous year, the ones that have served their time, are not simply thrown away. They are not left in a corner until they fall apart. They are retired with the same love and awareness with which they were first placed. And what Teresa taught was this: those palms, which have been present in the home for an entire year, witnesses to everything that happened there, companions to the family's prayers and sorrows and joys, have one last service to render. They are burned in prayer, offered for the relief of the souls in purgatory, especially the family's own departed loved ones. The palm that arrived as a sign of victory leaves as an offering of mercy. And in that complete cycle, from one Palm Sunday to the vigil of the next, there is an entire theology of the Christian home that Teresa lived and taught with the simplicity of someone who loves God and wants everyone else to love him well too. Now you know what the blessed palm truly is. You know why placement matters. You know which place silences it and which place lets it speak. And you know the prayer to say when you place it, so that what you bring home this Palm Sunday can be different from everything that came before. You made it this far, and that is not a small thing. In a world where everything competes for our attention, where every moment has 10 possible destinations, you chose to stay. You chose to listen. You chose to give your soul the time it needed to receive something that had perhaps been waiting a long while to reach you. And what you received today is not information. It is a light that has come on over something you already had, over something you may have been touching for years without fully knowing what you were holding. You thought you knew what the blessed palm was. You had received it many times. You had brought it home with faith. You had placed it where it seemed right, and that was enough, or so it seemed. But today, you heard something that Saint Teresa of Avila understood from the depths of her mystical experience and her life of prayer. Sacramentals are not passive objects. They are living signs that respond to the environment where we place them, to the intention with which we receive them, to the prayer with which we awaken them. And the palm you bring home on Palm Sunday can be, if you treat it for what it truly is, one of the most powerful sentinels the Church has ever placed at the disposal of the Christian home. You learned that placement matters, that not every space has the same openness to receive grace, that there are places in the home where the palm goes quiet, not because God abandons it, but because the surrounding context does not cooperate with its mission. And you learned which place that is, not to fill you with guilt over previous years, but so that this Palm Sunday you can do something different, something simple, something Teresa would do naturally and with love. Choose consciously the place where that palm will live during the coming year, surrounded by the other sacred signs in your home, in the space where your family prays or where they should be praying. You learned that renewed intention matters just as much as correct placement, that sacramentals need to be seen, recognized, remembered, that the soul that passes the palm and recalls, even for an instant, that Christ has won is performing an act of faith with real spiritual weight, that this instant of awareness, multiplied across the days and weeks of the year, builds in the home an atmosphere of grace that those who live there can feel even when they cannot name it, a lightness, a peace that settles, a greater ease in praying that wasn't there before. And you learned that the cycle of the palm has a beginning and an end that correspond with a beauty only a living spiritual tradition can sustain. The palm arrives as a sign of victory. It leaves as an offering of mercy. And across that arc, from one Palm Sunday to the next, it accompanies the family with a quiet faithfulness that deserves to be honored with the same awareness with which it was received. All of this you learned today, and now you carry it with you. You carry it into the home where you live, into the corners where your sacred objects stand, into the Palm Sunday that is coming, into the palm you will receive, which you will never see quite the same way again. That is exactly what Teresa wanted, not admiration, not distant reverence, but the concrete transformation of daily spiritual life, small changes that produce deep differences, faith that stops being habit and becomes living awareness. And if today, after hearing all of this, you feel that something in your home needs attention, that there is a palm in the wrong place, a space that needs to be prepared, a prayer that was never said over a sacramental that has been waiting years for it, do not leave it for later. The grace that waits does not grow old, but the soul that keeps postponing does lose something each time it says tomorrow. Today is the day. This moment is the moment. The palm you already have at home, even if it is from a previous Palm Sunday rather than the one coming up, deserves a fresh look and a simple prayer that wakes it up as a living sign in your home right now. But there is one more thing Teresa would say to you if she could sit beside you in this moment with that loving directness that made her so impossible to ignore. She would tell you that the palm is only the beginning, that the Christian home is a complex and beautiful spiritual organism that is built up by every sacred object that dwells in it, by every prayer said within its walls, by every conscious decision of those who live there to practice their faith not only in church but in the kitchen, in the sitting room, in the bedroom, in every corner where life unfolds. And that there are teachings about that organism, about its care and its protection, that you haven't yet heard. Teachings that Teresa left embedded in her writings and in the tradition of her convents, about other sacramentals, about other practices, about other ways in which God's grace can settle freely into the spaces where we live and love and struggle and pray. Those teachings are kept safe. They are waiting for you. And when you are ready to receive them, when your soul has had time to absorb what it received today and wants to go deeper, they will be here. Because the spiritual journey does not end with anyone teaching. Every understanding opens the door to the next. Every light that comes on reveals that there is more darkness still to be illuminated. And Teresa, who spent her whole life walking inward, always further inward, always closer to the center where God waits, invites you to keep walking too. May God bless you in your home. May the palm you receive this Palm Sunday find in your house a place worthy of what it is and a prayer to awaken it. May the victory of Christ that it proclaims be real and visible in every corner where you live. And may Saint Teresa of Avila, that small and tenacious woman who understood the mysteries of God from the inside and wanted everyone else to understand them too, accompany you with her powerful intercession on this road that never comes to its end. Until next time.